Any moment now, Nick Reiner will appear in court after being charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder for allegedly stabbing his parents to death in their Los Angeles home.
These charges carry a maximum sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole or the death penalty. No decision at this point has been made with respect to the death penalty.
For decades, Rob Reiner has occupied a familiar and influential role in American culture. The filmmaker, the political voice, the moral commentator who rarely hesitates to speak with certainty about right and wrong. Across interviews, televised panels, podcasts, and public appearances, Reiner has consistently positioned himself as someone unafraid to warn the country about dangerous behavior, corrosive ideologies, and the consequences of ignoring warning signs. He has spoken forcefully about accountability, about how patterns matter more than isolated moments, about how character reveals itself over time, and about the cost of silence when problems are allowed to fester unchecked. Again and again, his message has been clear. Societies fail not because warning signs don't exist, but because people choose not to confront them. But today, that public certainty is colliding with a deeply uncomfortable moment. Because following the publicly announced arrest of his son, Nick Reiner, a series of questions, some long dormant, others newly formed, have begun circulating with renewed intensity. Not accusations, not conclusions, but questions that refuse to disappear once they've been raised. According to statements released by the LAPD, later confirmed by Fox News Los Angeles, Nick Reiner was arrested following an incident that authorities say remains under investigation. Details remain limited. The legal process is ongoing, and as of now, Nick Reiner is entitled to the same presumption of innocence afforded to every individual under the law. That matters, and it must be said clearly. Arrests are not convictions. Investigations are not verdicts. Responsible discussion requires restraint, precision, and respect for due process, especially in moments when emotions and speculation can easily run ahead of facts. But what has unsettled many observers isn't the arrest alone. It's the growing sense that this moment did not emerge from nowhere, that it may represent a culmination rather than a beginning, a point where past rhetoric, public warnings, and long-standing themes suddenly feel uncomfortably relevant in a way they never were before. In the aftermath of the arrest, viewers have begun revisiting past interviews, public statements, and offhand remarks, not to rewrite history, but to reassess it. Clips once understood as political commentary or cultural critique are being watched again, now stripped of distance and abstraction. Statements about ignored red flags, about delayed accountability, about how problems escalate when they're dismissed as isolated or inconvenient, all of it sounds different when the context changes. And this reassessment isn't driven by outrage, it's driven by dissonance. For years, Rob Reiner warned that silence enables harm, that explanations can become excuses, that waiting too long to confront uncomfortable truths often leads to far more serious consequences down the line. Those warnings were delivered with confidence, aimed outward, framed as lessons for society at large. Now they echo closer to home. And the question forming quietly beneath the surface isn't a demand for condemnation. It's something far more unsettling than that. What happens when someone who spent years warning the public about ignored red flags is confronted with a situation that forces those warnings uncomfortably close to home? That question, unresolved, restrained, and impossible to ignore, is where this story truly begins. The words that echo back. Over the years, Rob Reiner has been a near-constant presence across cable news, podcasts, and political panels. His role was remarkably consistent. Interpreter of morality. He was the person brought in to explain why certain behavior was dangerous, why accountability mattered, and why society so often waits until it is too late to confront problems that were visible all along. In interview after interview, Reiner argued that character is not revealed in moments of success, applause, or achievement, but in patterns over time. Warning signs, he insisted, are rarely sudden or dramatic. They don't usually arrive as shocks. Instead, they emerge gradually, softened by familiarity, rationalized by affection, and excused by loyalty. According to Reiner, the real failure isn't that problems exist, but that people convince themselves not to see them until consequences make denial impossible. In one widely circulated interview from several years ago, Reiner spoke at length about what happens when troubling behavior is overlooked because it comes from someone close. He warned that proximity distorts judgment, that power, influence, reputation, and family loyalty can all become barriers to honest confrontation. He described how people often protect what feels familiar, even when warning signs are present, because facing them would require discomfort, conflict, or self-examination. At the time, those comments were framed as political critique, a cultural warning, a lecture aimed outward. They were applauded, shared widely, quoted approvingly as evidence of moral clarity and seriousness. They fit neatly into a broader narrative in which Reiner was seen as someone unafraid to speak uncomfortable truths about society's failures. Today, those same clips are being replayed through a very different lens. Again, it's critical to be clear. No one is alleging that Rob Reiner ignored or enabled criminal behavior. There is no public evidence suggesting that. This is not an accusation, and it should not be misrepresented as one. What has changed is the context, the language Reiner used, the certainty with which he spoke, the standards he demanded of others. All of it now exists alongside a situation that is no longer abstract or safely distant. It is personal, and that collision has altered how those past words are heard. Statements that once sounded theoretical now feel heavier, more complicated, harder to dismiss as mere rhetoric. Another resurfacing clip shows Reiner discussing what he once called selective outrage, the tendency, he argued, for powerful figures to condemn strangers swiftly and publicly while hesitating to examine their own inner circles with the same rigor. Moral credibility, he said, depends on consistency, on applying the same standards regardless of proximity or discomfort. Accountability, Reiner said in that interview, has to start at home or it means nothing. At the time, the line drew applause. It sounded firm. It sounded uncompromising. Today, it draws silence. Not because the principle itself is wrong, few would argue with it, but because principles are far easier to defend when they apply to someone else. They are far harder to grapple with when they turn inward, when they demand restraint, reflection, or a reassessment of one's own certainties. And it is that tension between past conviction and present complexity that has made these resurfaced clips impossible to view in the same way again. The arrest and the careful line. When news broke that Nick Reiner had been arrested, the initial reporting was restrained. Law enforcement confirmed the arrest. Fox News Los Angeles reported the basic facts. There was no rush to speculate, no dramatic framing, no public verdict. That restraint matters, because arrests are not convictions. Investigations are not verdicts. And responsible commentary requires acknowledging that difference. But public reaction does not exist in isolation. Nick Reiner is not a public figure in the traditional sense. He did not seek influence or authority. His father did. And Rob Reiner's decades-long role as a cultural moral enforcer has made this moment unavoidable. In past interviews, Reiner emphasized that context does not excuse behavior, that explanation should not become shields, that waiting indefinitely for perfect clarity can itself become a form of avoidance. Those words are now being quoted back, not as accusations, but as mirrors. And the unease many people feel isn't centered on Nick Reiner's case itself. That will be resolved in court. The discomfort lies in a broader cultural question. Why are some families granted patience and privacy, while others are subjected to immediate and relentless scrutiny? Rob Reiner has long argued that public accountability protects society, that silence enables harm, that difficult conversations must happen early, not after consequences become unavoidable. Now, the same public that listened to those arguments is watching to see how he responds when the issue is no longer theoretical. So far, Reiner has remained largely silent. And silence, while legally understandable, carries a different weight when placed beside years of very loud moral commentary. Ticking time bomb and the question of patterns. In the days following the arrest, a phrase began circulating online, not from law enforcement, not from official court documents, and not from any verified source. It emerged instead from commentators, viewers, and longtime observers revisiting old interviews and public material. Ticking time bomb. It's a phrase that immediately demands caution. It should not be treated as a diagnosis, a conclusion, or a statement of fact. It is not a legal determination, nor is it a medical or psychological claim. Used carelessly, language like this can mislead, and that distinction matters. But its sudden appearance in public discourse is still revealing, because the phrase doesn't reflect certainty, it reflects perception. A growing sense among some observers that this moment may represent not a sudden rupture, but a culmination, a point at which unresolved issues, whatever they ultimately prove to be, can no longer remain deferred. And that perception did not emerge in a vacuum. For years, Rob Reiner himself warned about exactly this kind of dynamic. In multiple interviews, he argued that society has a habit of ignoring escalating behavior because confronting it early is uncomfortable. He spoke about how warning signs are often rationalized, minimized, or reframed as misunderstandings until consequences make denial impossible. According to Reiner, the danger wasn't that problems arise, it was that people convince themselves those problems can wait. That familiarity dulls urgency. That loyalty discourages intervention. And that by the time action feels unavoidable, the cost is far higher than it ever needed to be. Importantly, Reiner never framed these failures as rare or extreme. He described them as common, predictable, patterns that repeat across institutions, families, and cultures when accountability is deferred in favor of convenience. That's why this language has resurfaced now. Viewers revisiting his past words aren't doing so to assign blame or rewrite events. They're trying to understand whether the framework he spent years describing, the slow accumulation of ignored warning signs, might be relevant in this situation as well. Not as a claim, not as an allegation, but as a question that refuses to settle quietly. Because questions like this don't emerge from thin air. They emerge when public rhetoric collides with private reality, when past warnings suddenly sound less theoretical and more uncomfortably close. And while no one can or should draw conclusions ahead of the legal process, the presence of these questions speaks to something deeper than any single case. It speaks to the uneasy realization that the very patterns people are warned about often feel obvious only in hindsight. That realization is not an accusation. It's a moment of reflection, a moment where people ask whether issues were missed, conversations delayed, or signals softened by proximity and trust. A moment where the line between abstract warning and lived experience becomes blurred. The phrase, ticking time bomb, should not be taken literally, but it does capture a fear many people recognize. The fear that problems left unaddressed don't disappear. They accumulate. They wait. And when they surface, they force everyone involved to ask the same uncomfortable question. Could this moment have been prevented? That question doesn't accuse. It doesn't convict. But it lingers, precisely because it echoes the warnings that were once delivered so confidently long before this moment arrived. Media, power, and uneven scrutiny. One reason this story resonates so strongly is because it reaches beyond one family or one arrest and taps into a much larger tension in American public life. It exposes the uneven way accountability is applied in modern media, not through overt bias or coordinated narratives, but through quieter, more subtle forms of protection and omission. When allegations involve individuals without cultural insulation, the response is often immediate and unforgiving. Headlines multiply within hours. Panels speculate before facts have settled. Social media rushes to judgment, collapsing investigation, accusation, and verdict into a single, irreversible moment. In those cases, caution is treated as weakness, and patience is framed as complicity. But when the situation touches someone embedded within the cultural elite, someone aligned with the right causes, institutions, and networks, the tone often shifts. The language softens, the coverage narrows. The urgency evaporates. Stories are framed carefully, sometimes minimally. Context replaces scrutiny. Silence replaces interrogation. Questions that would normally be asked loudly are deferred indefinitely or not asked at all. The same media voices that demand transparency and accountability in other cases suddenly rediscover the importance of privacy, restraint, and waiting. Rob Reiner has existed comfortably within that ecosystem for decades. His public statements are rarely challenged with sustained skepticism. His moral judgments are often treated as self-evident truths rather than claims worthy of examination. When he speaks, he is usually amplified, not interrogated. The assumption has long been that his conclusions are correct and that his certainty itself is evidence of credibility. That history is precisely why this moment feels different. Not because of what the media has done, but because of what it hasn't done. There has been no sustained examination of the contrast between Rob Reiner's past rhetoric and his present silence. No broad discussion of how his long-articulated standards apply when circumstances become personal. No serious attempt to engage with the tension his own words have created. Instead, the resurfacing clips have circulated outside traditional channels. They weren't promoted by networks. They weren't elevated by major publications. They spread organically, shared by viewers who remembered what Reiner said in earlier interviews and noticed what he is not saying now. That organic response matters. It signals a shift in how audiences process information. Rather than waiting for institutional framing, people are comparing the public record themselves. They are holding past statements alongside present events and drawing conclusions quietly, without editorial guidance. And that contrast, between loud moral certainty then and near total restraint now, is proving more powerful than any accusation ever could. Because it doesn't rely on speculation. It doesn't depend on allegations. It doesn't require assigning guilt. It relies on memory, on recorded words, on public positioning, on the space between principle and practice. In that space, trust doesn't collapse dramatically. It erodes slowly. And once that erosion begins, it is far harder to reverse than any single headline. The human pause. It's important to pause here. Behind every headline is a family dealing with something real, painful, and deeply personal. No serious or responsible person should celebrate that. Legal crises are not entertainment, and moments like this should never be treated as spectacle or fodder for outrage-driven consumption. Rob Reiner is a father. Nick Reiner is a son facing a legal process that belongs in a courtroom, not on social media timelines or comment sections. That distinction matters. The justice system exists precisely to prevent emotion, speculation, and public pressure from replacing evidence and due process. Whatever the outcome of this case may be, it will be determined by facts, law, and procedure, not by headlines, viral clips, or public sentiment. Nothing about this situation should be treated lightly. At the same time, another reality exists alongside that necessary compassion. Public figures do not get to fully separate their moral branding from their real lives when those lives intersect with the standards they have spent years demanding of others. That isn't cruelty. It isn't opportunism. It's an inevitable consequence of choosing to occupy the role of public moral authority. For decades, Rob Reiner has spoken not as a neutral observer, but as a moral voice. He has urged society to confront uncomfortable truths early. He has warned that silence enables harm. He has argued that accountability loses its meaning when it is selectively applied. Those positions were not hidden. They were central to his public identity. Acknowledging that reality does not require condemnation. It requires consistency. If accountability matters, it matters universally, not only when it is politically convenient or emotionally distant. If caution matters, it matters always, not just when circumstances feel safe or abstract. If presumption of innocence matters, it matters for everyone, not only for those with cultural insulation, resources, or influential allies. Principles do not gain their value from ease. They gain it from application under pressure. And this is where the resurfaced clips hit hardest, because they were not reckless remarks made in passing. They were not impulsive comments delivered in moments of anger. They were carefully constructed moral judgments, articulated with confidence, repeated across years, and offered as guidance for how society should behave when confronted with warning signs. Those words were meant to set standards. Now, they stand alone, not refuted, not revised, not contextualized, simply present, unchanged, and placed beside a moment that tests their durability. Silence in this context does not automatically imply guilt or failure, but it does create tension. It invites reflection. It forces comparison between rhetoric and reality, between certainty and complexity, between public principle and private pain. This is not about demanding statements or performances. It is not about forcing anyone into the spotlight during a difficult moment. It is about recognizing that when someone builds authority on moral clarity, moments of ambiguity carry added weight. Sometimes the most revealing moments are not marked by what is said, but by what remains unsaid. Not because silence is wrong, but because it exposes how difficult it can be to live inside the standards once applied so confidently to others. And it is that quiet collision between past judgment and present restraint that continues to give this story its gravity. Why this story lingers? This story will not linger because of Nick Reiner's case alone. Courts will handle that as they are meant to, through evidence, procedure, and due process rather than speculation or emotion. The legal system will determine what matters legally, and that process should be allowed to unfold without interference. What will cause this story to linger is something broader and far more cultural. It exposes a pattern that many Americans are increasingly unwilling to ignore, a cultural class that speaks loudly and confidently about morality, accountability, and responsibility, but expects restraint, privacy, and patience when consequences draw close to home. A class that treats moral certainty as a public posture, yet seeks insulation when that certainty is tested by personal reality. For years, Rob Reiner has argued that leadership is revealed in moments of discomfort, that true character emerges not when circumstances are easy or applause is guaranteed, but when situations are painful, complex, and inconvenient. He has said that silence in those moments can become a form of avoidance, a way to defer accountability rather than confront it. He has also insisted that moral authority is not something a person claims for themselves. It is something earned, tested, and reaffirmed under pressure. Those statements were not made casually. They were delivered deliberately, repeated often, and offered as guidance to the public. And now they exist permanently as part of the public record. That record is what the public is watching, quietly, attentively, and without the appetite for spectacle that often defines viral moments. People are not watching the scandal. They are not watching for revenge. They are not watching to see a family torn apart in public. They are watching for coherence. They are watching to see whether the standards preached for decades still apply when circumstances are no longer theoretical, whether principles remain intact when they no longer serve as tools for critique but instead demand restraint, humility, and consistency. Because when moral language only functions at a distance, it loses its credibility. And when accountability collapses under proximity, it reveals something uncomfortable not just about individuals, but about the culture that elevated them as arbiters of right and wrong. This moment is not a verdict. It is a test of whether moral authority can withstand personal discomfort, a test of whether public rhetoric survives private reality, and a test of whether the values so often invoked still matter when they no longer point outward. That unresolved tension, quiet, persistent, and impossible to ignore, is why this story will not simply fade away. If this breakdown helped you understand why these questions are emerging now, make sure you're subscribed. We focus on careful analysis, not outrage, and on consistency, not convenience. And while you're here, check out our merch store. The link is in the description. Every purchase helps support independent commentary that doesn't shy away from uncomfortable moments. The story is not a verdict. It is a reflection. Because accountability only works when it applies evenly. And critical thinking matters most when narratives grow quiet instead of loud. Thanks for watching. And remember, in moments like this, seriousness, fairness, and consistency matter more than ever.